Welcome to Thriving Together, Stories from CCEJ, a podcast from the California Conference for Equality and Justice. Our mission is to educate and empower youth and adults to lead change for equity and justice in our communities. I'm Daniel Solis, your host. In this episode, we're bringing you a powerful discussion from the 2025 Roots of Justice Convening. On February 28th, we had the honor of welcoming Jenan Mohajir, Vice President of External Affairs at Interfaith America, to be in dialogue with Reena Hajat Carroll, CCEJ's Executive Director. Together, they explored what it means to embrace pluralism, how we can lean into curiosity, and why building bridges across differences is essential for justice and belonging, especially in the current moment. Get ready for a thought-provoking and inspiring discussion that challenges us to rethink how we engage with one another across divides. Let's listen.
To have a conversation with Jenan, who came all the way from Chicago, who, as you heard a little bit in the program, wasn't feeling great yesterday, but mustered up enough energy and spirit to be here with us to have this amazing conversation about many things related to bridge building, civility, pluralism, all the things that we probably are not supposed to be talking about, depending on who you ask. And as we lean into some of CCEJ's most important values around curiosity and imagination, I would love to start our conversation by expressing a curiosity. I am so curious. If those in the federal government saw and experienced what we are experiencing today, if instead of eliminating DEI, if maybe they would embrace it, maybe they would expand it, maybe they would elevate it. Because what is happening today, thank you. What is happening today, the joy and the love that I have experienced in the last 60 minutes in this room is more powerful than anything else that can happen on the counter side of elimination. We are here today because we believe in these values, and CCEJ is not going anywhere. We have been here for 60 years, and we are going to continue to do the work of bringing people together of all different faiths, of races, sexual orientations, genders, and we have that in this room. It is so beautiful and incredible, and we are excited to continue the work. With that, Jenan, I would love to just get into conversation with you. You have been doing such important work at Interfaith America for almost 2 decades around bridge building, bringing together different people of different religions, which, as you know, NCCJ or CCEJ, that was how we started. We were the National Conference for Christians and Jews. We then realized there were so many identities that needed attention and needed to be brought together, frankly. Can you talk to us a little bit about Interfaith America's position on pluralism? Maybe also share with us what it is and why it's so important. And we're so excited to be able to learn from everyone today. But today would love to just learn a little bit from you about why pluralism is important and what it has looked like for Interfaith America over the last 2 decades.
Thank you for that, and thank you all for having me today, and pardon me for my raspy voice. My name is Jenan Mohajir. As you mentioned, Reena, I've been working at Interfaith America for almost 2 decades, and I think I want to start with a really quick story about how I came into this work, which I think will speak a little bit to our positioning around pluralism. So I'm at the tail end of Gen X, so I was in college in the early 2000s, and my family is Muslim and from India. I like to say I have ambiguously brown face, so I can be mistaken to be from many different parts of the world. I was born in India, in southern India. I was raised in Qatar. My dad was an engineer working in Qatar in the 80s and 90s. And then my family moved to Chicago, to the suburbs of Chicago, when I was just shy of my 16th birthday. Now, I say all of that because those are all very different places to grow up. And those of us who are third culture kids often know that what it means to be a third culture kid is to be from everywhere and nowhere at the same time, right? Home can be many different places, and you're never quite at home because you're from so many different places. And growing up that way, I made a choice to My family was culturally Muslim at the time when I was growing up. We ate the food, wore the clothes, celebrated the holidays. But we didn't have necessarily a ritual, prayer practice, etc. So when I started college at a Catholic university, I was asking myself a lot of questions about belonging and about what it meant to be a young person who was really invested in doing volunteering work in my city on the south and west sides of Chicago. I was very drawn to the specific Catholic teachings of my university and was trying to look for, ways of connection to that space. And what that took me to is it took me back to my own Muslim roots. So as I was navigating that in college, I was in front of a classroom full of freshman students in my senior year, and this was the morning of 9/11. And I knew really quickly that I would not be talking about service learning and Muslim inspirations for service in that moment. There was a young man on one side of the room who raised his hand and said, "Why do Muslims hate Americans?" And there was another young man on the other side of the room who was a Muslim American student who raised his hand and said, "Why does everyone think we had anything to do with this heinous crime?" And I realized as a young person in front of that room, I didn't have the skills to make that conversation a productive one. And I looked at the professor who was teaching the class, and I realized he didn't have the skills to make that conversation a productive one. And when I left that room, I had 2 missed calls on my Nokia flip phone at the time. One of them was from my dad telling me to come home, and one of them was from my campus ministry mentor, who was basically calling to check on me. His name is Carl Nass. We are, 25 years out, still friends, still in touch. And I realized part of what that space needed was the relationship that Carl and I had managed to develop over the last 4 years. And that really came from a place of deep curiosity. It didn't come from a place of equalizing what our differences or beliefs were. But it came from a place of recognition that there are things that will be very different, whether that's cultural context, whether that's religious belief, whether that's theology or culture or politics. There may be very deep differences between us, but there are also shared values that can connect us around common causes for concern. So I say all of that because that's essentially how Interfaith America defines pluralism. Pluralism, sometimes we call it civic pluralism, because for us, even though our particular view of pluralism comes from recognizing that religious diversity is anchored in as one of the foundational values for the creation of the United States, it's a foundational value that's both a positive one and a not so positive one, right? 20% of enslaved people who were brought to the American shores were Muslim from different parts of West and East Africa. And the Founding Fathers also had a deep understanding of what it means to give religious pluralism a voice in the ways that they thought about founding this country. So that tension that is present at the founding of our nation is also very much present in our space today. So the way that we think about civic pluralism is really in 3 parts. The shorthand version of that is respect, relate, cooperate. The longhand version of that is that we have to start at a place of curiosity, of being able to show each other the courtesy of hearing each other's stories. And it is very hard to disagree with somebody's story and experience. It's very easy to throw data points at each other, and especially in a world where data and fact is no longer anchored, it's very easy for that to be an unproductive conversation. So we start at the point of sharing our stories, sharing our narratives, sharing our lived experiences, showing curiosity with one another, asking questions. The second part is creating mutually inspiring relationships. So understanding that we may not have agreement across the board. We may have very different theological beliefs, we may have very different political beliefs, etc. But it's important to still figure out how to have a relationship with someone who believes differently than you. And the third part of that is that it's not just enough to have relationship. But actually, it's more important to then figure out what is the collective power that you have in those relationships to address issues of common concern. And how can you come together around literacy rates in your community, even if you disagree on another topic of concern? How can you come together around addressing the unhoused population and giving people dignified ways to live their life, even if you disagree on other issues of concern? So those are the three ways that we define pluralism that make up what pluralism looks like for us.
Thank you so much. We could dig into each of those points and be here for the rest of the day, but unfortunately we don't get to. So I want to go back to something you just said about your own diversity. You have lived in different places, and similarly to you, I think I've shared with you before, my mother is Hindu, my father's Muslim, my mother grew up in India, my father grew up in East Africa, my son is at a Lutheran school, and as we speak, taking a test on the books and chapters of the New Testament, which I then had to learn to try to quiz him last night, right? And so I am in the middle of this diversity. You are in the middle of the diversity, right? I think we've also shared we have biracial children. My kid's father is black. Your kid's father is Palestinian, right? And so we've got diversity in our lives, right? But what happens for the person that doesn't have that diversity, isn't afforded it, isn't inherently in it? How do they learn? How do they become curious about something that they don't know or haven't seen or maybe don't have access to?
Thank you for that question. We often come across that when we work with over 1,000 college campuses across the country. And sometimes some of those campuses are fairly homogenous communities. And one of the ways that we like to frame this work is that even if you are not living in this moment in a space where that diversity is very present, part of the responsibility for our communities is to prepare our generations to live in a very diverse world, which is the reality of our world, both in physical spaces, but also in online spaces, right? So my children, who are 13, 10, and 9, who will be very upset with me if I use any of their alpha language in my talk today, think it is like bizarro that we have to meet people only in person, right? For them, it's like the way that they engage the world is through their tablets and their phones. So the diversity is coming to you whether or not you want it, right? That's the reality of the world that we have. It's coming to you whether you want it or not. And are we preparing people to engage one another in those ways? I think one of the best ways to engage diversity or to engage the curiosity if you don't have that present in your own sort of physical spaces is to think about seeking out stories and narratives that are different from yours. And that is one of the best ways to both humanize a people, a community, a person who you don't know much about, is through encountering their story, through being curious about their life experience, and then also inviting that into your spaces. So my children are part Palestinian, part Indian, part Irish. We have all of the things. And part of one of the things that I really committed to when they were much younger is we would have, books about various different kinds of cultural and religious holidays. So even if they didn't know somebody who was Jewish, or know somebody who was Hindu, or know somebody who was of another faith or cultural identity as them, they had some information and some story to anchor it in, so that when they met that person, they had something to reach back into their own experience to grab.
I do want to talk to you, though, about something that is serious and a little harder to talk about, which is this concept of dehumanization that, unfortunately, I feel like we have been seeing a lot of. Can you talk about experiences that you've had where you have seen us in community dehumanize one another, and then how do we pivot? What do we do? What are the skills that we need to turn that conversation or experience around?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think one of the most important things so I'll frame this by saying, I think bridge building work, engagement work, interfaith work, whatever you want to call it, it gets a really bad rep. Because people think this is like the kumbaya, we're gonna put our differences aside, we're just gonna talk about the good stuff, we're gonna talk about hummus and samosas, and like that's what it's gonna be. But in reality, engagement work or bridge building work is actually very hard to do. Because you have to hold in tension your own convictions and beliefs and still show curiosity with someone that you may deeply disagree with. And that is actually much harder to do than it is to ignore those differences and pretend like they don't exist, right? What I have said specifically over the last 2 years very loudly, but for a long time, is that this can be exhausting work. And it's actually very important to do the self-work, to know where your own limits are, to know where your own red lines are, so that you are able to tag in and out. This is a team sport, y'all. This is not an individual sport. This is a team sport. So you have to be able to say, like, right now, I can't do this. And that has to be okay. And someone else has to say, you know what, I got you. I will do this instead for however long you need me to. And when you're ready, you will tack back in. And it will be fine. We will figure it out. I don't think we should see that as a defeat. I don't think we should see that as taking a step back, but rather as a way to actually honor the differences and the deep complexity and tension of doing this work.
Beautiful, absolutely. And so just to normalize how hard this work is and to be able to really tap into ourselves, can you talk about what post-October 7th has been like for you? I know for us at CCEJ, we have experienced a range of emotions, leaning from hurt, upset, disappointed, to uncertain, to we're done, we all just want to go work at a coffee shop, right? All the different emotions.
Amen.
Because it's been so hard. Can you talk about being in this space, doing this day in and day out, what October 7th and post has been for you?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I was actually traveling on October 7th. I was traveling for work. I was coming back from a work trip when we started seeing the news sort of come through our phones. And I made an effort to reach out to my colleague, Rebecca Russo, who is Jewish. And Rebecca and I have worked together at Interfaith America for over 10 years. And I reached out to her because I knew she had family in Israel. And I wrote to her, I texted her and said, hey, I'm thinking about you. I hope you're okay. I hope your family's okay. And then I texted my son, who was home, who is 13, who is very proud of his Palestinian Indian heritage, and just said, try to stay away from the news on the phone, and we will have a conversation when I get home. And Rebecca and I have spent a lot of time over the last 18 months or so really sort of talking about our relationship, our friendship, specifically in this moment where lots of Muslim and Jewish communities are not in relationship with one another. And to kind of think about, how do we keep navigating this very difficult space? And at the same time, I have Palestinian children. My ex-husband's family, our family, is a family who left in 1948 when they lost their ancestral village. My ex-husband and I were able to actually visit his ancestral village through some work that we did together with the Jewish Institute in Jerusalem. And it was very hard to be there and to not see any markers of Palestinian or Muslim life in this village of his, which is where his family's from. And also carrying the guilt that his family would not be able to make that visit or pilgrimage, right? When I drove my son to school that Monday morning, a day and a half after October 7th, I gave him a little pep talk. I was like, I know you watch the CNN newsreels at the end of your social studies class. It might feel weird. Talk to me if you have anything. And his response to me was, it's okay, Mama, I'm used to the racism. And that was heartbreaking, knowing that he had already made his peace with the fact that that was going to be a conversation that was not a safe conversation for him. And in the months that passed, he came up to me a few times and said, is it possible for me to speak up for Palestine without being called a terrorist? And the answer to that should be yes. And what we're seeing in the country today is over the last, since October 7th, threats against Jewish communities have tripled. So anti-Semitism is on the rise. Threats against Muslim communities are at a 30-year high. So we started tracking Islamophobia threats against Muslim communities 30 years ago, and they have been the highest in the last year and a half. And that is just not a sustainable reality. Specifically given the realities of what we're seeing in our national front, it's just not sustainable. So for us, it has really been about navigating this through the lens of knowing when you need to take a step back, to do your own healing, to do your own processing, and then when you are able to step back into that space of being curious and being able to engage. And it's okay if that's not possible in the short term.
For us, I know at CCEJ, we had many moments where we thought, we can't engage because we actually just don't even know how. It was really difficult for us because we had people really saying to us, you need to take a position this way, and you need to take a position this way, and if you don't, we're going to stop donating. And they did in both instances, right? And what was interesting was that this bridge building space and this space of pause and healing was not normalized and was not actually okay, right? And I'm really curious, how do we get more people on this train of bridge building? Takes time, it takes meaning, it takes relationship building, it takes intention, and it's okay for us to have the pause, because it just feels right now so polarized.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important, this is where, when a crisis of this magnitude is upon us, that is not the time to start the bridge building work, right? Because when the crisis is upon you, you are not in your anchored state. You are in trauma brain. I'm just going to use that word. And when you're in trauma brain, the better parts of yourselves are not the selves that are coming forward. So if there isn't a place where this has already been anchored, it is not possible to start this work in crisis. Bridge building work is the long game. You have to start it behind closed doors sometimes. You have to start it in small rooms with stakeholders, and then slowly bring in people. It is the long game. It takes a lot of strategy, and it takes a lot of time. And there will be setbacks, because we live in a world where there are setbacks. And then you just have to pick up and start over again. What I will say is also that the expectation that we can come to the table to be bridge builders when we haven't done some of that inner healing and processing is just a false expectation. We're not going to be able to actually understand what is being presented to us if we don't feel holistic and healed on the insides, right? So that is something that will take time, and it's really important to recognize that everyone might not be in that place. But who are the stakeholders who can take those risks? Who are the stakeholders who can be people who are having those conversations, whether it's in public or in private? And that's, I think, identifying those people and building social capital with those people is really important.
I do want to ask you a question about the next generation. So we talk a lot about our kids. My kids are 14 and 8, and they have lots of questions about what is happening in the world, right? And I am curious about this next generation of leaders, the people that are going to sit in our seats in the next 20 years or so. What are your aspirations for them?
Oh my gosh, so many aspirations. So I think partially what is really easy, the interesting thing about social media and being glued to our screens is that in one sense, it opens up the whole universe to you. And in a different sense, it squarely puts you in an echo chamber. Because the way that social media works is that the more you click on something, the more the algorithm will give you that thing. So my Jewish colleague Rebecca and I oftentimes will have this once in a while, be like, let's compare our Facebook feeds, or let's compare our Instagram feeds. And there is no overlap in our feeds. Like, absolutely no overlap, right? Because that's just how social media, like, functions. The algorithm is that it will show you the thing that it thinks you want to see, and it will not show you the other thing that you may disagree with. So in some ways, I think our biggest challenge with this upcoming generation is to give them the tools to be curious with one another, whether that's in person or online, and to give them the tools to actually question when something is presented to them as fact, to make sure that it is in fact coming from a place of trust. And that, I think, are two really important things.
Before we get to a couple of these questions, I do want to ask you a really personal question, because I think, again, it is so important that we show up as humans. We are normalizing the pain, the uncertainty, the challenges, the highlights, the joy, all of it. What are you doing to take care of yourself in the moment?
So this is a sort of a cop-out answer. When I'm not doing Interfaith America work, I perform with a storytelling company called Second Story. I don't do a lot of performances. I do like one performance a year. And I think, to me, that's one of the ways that I get to kind of separate myself from the professional storytelling that I'm doing, to then lean into, stories that are personal about my kids or about the things that are happening, in my personal life. And it's a really values-based process for me, because it gives me the chance to actually think through and heal through things that are unresolved. And that is one way that I end up taking care of myself, is through being on stage, being a storyteller.
Thank you. And related to that, we have a couple questions about the current moment and how do we get through it? It is so much, right? We're waking up every day to a different headline, which I am in a space of being so resistant to, because they are so challenging, and particularly as it relates to the DEI executive orders, the ICE raids, the immigration pieces, right? There is the LGBT community, the attacks there, right? These are all of the things that CCEJ stands for. And again, we are not going anywhere. We are standing really firm. But how do we show up in this moment when there is so much coming at us, and so much that is in just direct conflict with who we are and what we believe?
I think this is a moment for really sort of leaning into our local communities to start off, to get to know your neighbors. Who are they? Actually have those very deep local connections with people. Lean into the spaces where you can think about the needs of your communities and what those needs require, and actually be very present in that. I think that's one thing that we can do to push back against the intentional chaos that we are sitting in, that are coming through from our federal government, from the headlines, et cetera. And that's it's an intentional overwhelming, right? It's to send us into a place of despair and to not be able to function in some ways. So being very locally connected and present and active is really important. And then I think it's really important for all of us to have our people. And you get to decide who your people are. I'm not going to tell you who your people are, right? You get to decide who your people are, whether they're your family, whether they're your chosen family, whether they're your local community, like your religious community, whether it's your YMCA, whatever it may be. You get to have your people, and that needs to be a place of refuge for each of us. And it needs to be a place of regeneration. It needs to be a place of energy. And I will say, beware of the trauma Olympics, because that sends us to an unproductive place rather than a productive place. And there's a metaphor that we often use at Interfaith America that our founder started, called the potluck nation. So it's reframing America from the melting pot kind of metaphor to saying that actually we're a nation. I'm Midwestern, can you tell? That we're a potluck nation. And what it means to have a potluck nation is that everybody gets to bring their best dish to the table, and everybody gets to pick what they're gonna eat. You may not eat the pecan pie because you're allergic to pecans. You may not eat the very delicious collard greens because you're Muslim and you're not sure if there's bacon in it, right? You may not eat the shrimp because you're Jewish and you don't eat shellfish, but it gets to be at the table. And you get to compliment your hosts, and you get to share in that meal, and you get to be there in your comfort zone. And guess what? Maybe the next time you go to the potluck, the dish that you could have eaten but you didn't eat, you're like, okay, maybe I'll try that. That's the vision of these communities that we'd like to push forward, is what does it mean to be part of a community where there is diversity, where you get to bring your best dish to the table, you get to choose which of those dishes you're going to engage in, but everybody is welcome. And it is a space where you will be honored and your story will have voice.
Thank you for sharing that. It was bringing me back to about 15 years ago, an experience I had, and I would love to ask you just a little bit about how you might have responded and how we tie in this concept of grace and forgiveness into bridge building. So about 15 years ago, I was in St. Louis. I was running the Interfaith Partnership and was invited to go to lunch with the Archdiocese of St. Louis. And my board chair and I showed up at the Archdiocese's home, which is beautiful and amazing. My board chair at the time was Harvey Schneider, a very Jewish man, and then myself. And one might assume from my last name that I'm Muslim, or maybe by looking at me, that I was Hindu, so I didn't maybe eat meat, or if I was Muslim, I didn't eat pork. Harvey, my very Jewish board chair, didn't eat pork, right? And we were served for lunch pork tenderloin. That was the lunch. Wow. The face of this poor archdiocese, I'm forgetting, Raymond Burke was his name, Archdiocese Burke, was one I will never forget. He was completely red and so embarrassed, right, that when he opened the plate to see what was being served, and so apologetic. They worked so quickly to get us different food. And in that moment, though, we were there to bridge build, right? There was a colossal mistake that had been made about food. One actually that we made here at CCJ, some of you might remember. We served bacon on those plates just a couple years ago. Not anymore. One that we learned from. Will you tell us about grace, forgiveness? How does all of this intersect with this idea of bridge building?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's always important to honor the things that you need to honor for yourself and to let that be known. So I would say, if I was in your shoes at this lunch and I was served, I'm a Muslim also, I also don't eat pork, that I was served pork tenderloin, I'd just be like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I can't eat this, right? So I think that it is possible to hold on to your values and to not compromise on that part of yourself that are really important to you and still show grace in that moment to the person who maybe, in this case, I'm guessing that it was just an error. It was whoever was in charge of the menu did not have enough religious diversity training that you need in order to make the right choice, right? So I think it's really important in that sense to show the grace, to show understanding that there was a mistake, and then to basically move on and to not dwell on that for too long.
Thank you. And this is related to one of the audience questions. How can we combat discomfort when trying to speak up for ourselves? In that moment, while I was at lunch, maybe I was feeling really uncomfortable about the situation, but what do we do? How do I speak up?
If you don't speak up for yourself, no one's going to speak up for you. So we have to be able to take control of our own narrative and our own needs. We can do that in ways that are inviting and are graceful. And I'll give you a religious tool that I use, which also can be construed as an interfaith tool, I guess. So before I do any kind of speaking engagements like today, I often take a moment to read the verses from the Quran that are directly related to Moses when he was preparing to go and face Pharaoh. So there is a prayer that Moses does, which basically is invoking God's mercy on him. And he says, open my breast and make my speech clear. Because the understanding was that Moses had a bit of a speech impediment and sometimes would struggle with that. So he had these verses that are in the Quran that basically say, open my breast and make my speech clear so that those who are hearing me will hear what I intend. And And I always read that prayer before I get on any kind of stage or microphone or whatever. And part of that is because it's a ritual that is important to me and to my religious sensibility, but it's also a way to put myself in the mind frame of how am I going to respond if something difficult is thrown at me. And I think that it's important to speak truth in those moments. I think that we can speak truth to each other with kindness, and that the person that you are pushing back against might be able to hear you more if that's the case. Taking a risk at the end of the thing. I'll tell a story. So I was, a few years ago, I was invited to speak at this modern Orthodox synagogue in Chicago. The rabbi and I were friends, so he asked me to come speak about my own experience of doing Muslim-Jewish work and also my experience of being in Jerusalem. So as I was having this conversation with him, I noticed that one of the Jewish aunties, she was an elder in the community, was getting very agitated, and I could tell she was very uncomfortable with what I was saying. And she comes up to me afterwards and says, you know, it sounds like you had a very thinly veiled criticism of Israel. And I said, oh, auntie, it was a criticism of Israel. It's not veiled. But your rabbi invited me to do that. So I'm happy to have this conversation with you, but really you should speak to your rabbi, because he wanted to have this conversation that may have been uncomfortable to some of his congregants. And then we had a conversation with him, and we didn't agree on the things that she took issue with me saying, and that was okay. But it's possible to also diffuse that in a way that gives her the respect of being the elder of that community and still pushes back against the notion that I did something wrong by challenging her comfort.
This last question about bridge building. For some people in the audience, they may have never heard the term bridge builder. Today might be the first time of learning of the concept, of the title. Can you talk a little bit about what anchors you as a bridge builder?
Oh, that's super easy for me. It's my Muslim identity. So I think for me, Islam is really the reason why, that is the entry point for me into bridge building work, because that is a space where I feel very rooted in terms of my own convictions and beliefs. And I also recognize I live in a world that is majority not Muslim. So in order to be able to live as a citizen and to be present in public spaces, I have to be able to bridge with people who believe differently than me, politically, culturally, religiously, etc. And that, I think, is very, for me, it's just part and parcel of my Muslim identity, and that's kind of where I root it.
Thank you. So appreciating that answer. It is also making me think of the story about the auntie. It was bringing back to me something that I've said a couple times in over the last 2 years in particular, is that I might be the only non-Jewish identified person with a rabbi. I absolutely love the two rabbis that are in my life, and it is incredible to me, right, because what I think happens is that when we move beyond the labels and the barriers, we get to see humanity, right? Yeah. And we just get to show up for people in the most beautiful and touching way, and I think that's why we do this work, right? That's why we're here, and that's why we've been here, and we're gonna continue to be here. And so I thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure to share the morning with you. We heard so many different pieces around tools in our toolbox, right? Do we have the tools? Do we have the skills to have really productive dialogue? I think this is such a critical question that we have to ask ourselves. And if people want to develop those skills, they should talk to CCEJ. They should talk to Interfaith America. They should talk to a number of organizations. There are so many great places that you can gain those skills, so thank you for that reminder. You talked about respect and cooperation. You talked to us about how we have to honor stories, how we have to engage in hearing, yes, data and stories. Both are so important. You talked to us a little bit about how we have to know our limits. We have to know who we are to engage in this really challenging and rewarding work. And then what I think the audience really responded to and loved hearing, that this is a team sport. And we are in this together, and we know that, we believe that to be true. and that is the only way. Is there anything else you would add as we conclude the morning and you've heard all of the amazing, beautiful things that you told us? Anything else that you want to add?
I'll just share a couplet that we often use at Interfaith America from the American poet Edwin Markham, who said, "He drew a circle that drew me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout, but love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that drew him in." And I think those few verses have been something that we have recited a lot at Interfaith America, specifically in the last few years. So I'm just really grateful for the large circles of inclusivity that you are drawing here, and thank you for including me in that.
Thank you to Jenan and Reena for this meaningful conversation. We hope it sparked new ways of thinking about pluralism, curiosity, and bridge building in divided times. If you want to deepen your own bridge building, check out CCEJ trainings and upcoming events by visiting us at cacej.org/trainings. CCEJ's podcast is sponsored in part by LA vs. Hate, a coalition of partners led by the LA County Human Relations Commission, who are committed to preventing and ending hate in our communities. Once again, I'm Daniel Solis, and don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to hear more stories of thriving together.